A group of friends, 5 in total, decided to get away from their daily routine and spend a weekend camping in the mountains near San Rafael, far away from any city or main road. The plan was to disconnect from technology and enjoy nature in its purest form. Despite the area having a certain reputation due to unexplained incidents in the past, the young people saw it as an opportunity to have an exciting adventure. The trip started well, though the cell phone signal quickly disappeared as they ventured deeper into the forest. As the path became harder to navigate, they finally reached a clearing where they decided to set up camp. The afternoon turned into night as they pitched their tents, and soon the only sounds surrounding them were the crackling of the fire and the whispering of the leaves. The first night passed without major incidents, filled with laughter and jokes around the fire. However, the next morning, Tomas, the most adventurous of the group, noticed that his boots, which he had left outside his tent, had disappeared. He thought one of his friends was playing a prank on him, but everyone denied knowing anything about it. The group felt strangely uneasy about the missing boots, as there were no signs of animals or human footprints to explain what had happened. Despite the discomfort, they decided to stick to their plan of hiking a nearby trail. The trail was tough, almost entirely covered by vegetation, and seemed to lead them deeper into the forest. After several hours, they came across an abandoned cabin in poor condition, with broken windows and a partially collapsed roof. Although some of the group didn't want to stop, Tomas's curiosity convinced them to take a look. Upon entering, the atmosphere inside the cabin was oppressive. The walls were marked with carvings made by some sharp object, and amidst the debris on the floor, Mariana found a dirty notebook filled with incomprehensible scribbles, as if someone had written in the middle of a crisis. The place was permeated with a foul smell, like something that had been rotting for a long time. Suddenly, a loud noise outside startled them. Tomas went to the window but couldn't see anything. The group began to get nervous, and after a few minutes they decided it was best to return to the camp. The return felt much longer and more tense, as if the forest had suddenly become hostile. By the time they arrived, night had already fallen, and a palpable sense of danger hung in the air. That night, sitting around the fire, no one could shake the feeling that they were being watched. The atmosphere grew heavy, and though they tried to continue joking, the nervousness was evident. Every small sound in the forest made everyone glance around with unease. The sense that something was not right intensified with each passing minute. In the middle of the night, Camilla woke up to what sounded like a murmur. At first she thought one of her friends was talking in their sleep, but when the whispers became clearer, she realized they were coming from outside. Scared, she opened her tent's zipper just a bit and peeked out. The fire had gone out and she could barely see beyond the faint light of the moon. Then among the trees she saw a human figure moving stealthily, as if spying on them. Terrified, Camilla quickly zipped the tent back up. She stayed still, holding her breath until the sound stopped. However, the fear kept her awake all night. When the sun rose, Camilla was no longer in her tent. Everything seemed in place, but there was no trace of her. The rest of the group panicked. They searched for Camilla all over the camp and the surrounding area, but there was no sign of her. They decided to leave the place as soon as possible. However, when they set out to return along the path that had brought them there, they were met with something even more perplexing. The backpacks they had left by the camp were scattered and their supplies were gone. Filled with fear and anxiety, they tried to remember the way back, but the forest, with its uneven terrain and dense vegetation, quickly disoriented them. It wasn't that the trail had disappeared, but it seemed as if someone had manipulated the surroundings, making any attempt to return in vain. As they moved on, they saw clear signs that they were not alone. Footprints in the dirt and broken branches indicated that they had been followed. The group, increasingly exhausted and scared, started to run, but they constantly felt the threat of being watched and stalked. Their breathing became fast and the fear of the unknown overwhelmed them. Who was behind this? What had happened to Camilla? The feeling that something very real and not paranormal was playing with them kept them on high alert. In the end, desperation overtook everyone. They didn't know if they would be able to escape the forest or if whoever was following them would allow them to. They had talked for years about going camping together, but it had always been hard to coordinate their schedules. Finally, they managed to get a weekend off and decided to camp in a remote location in the mountains near Santiago de Chile. The place promised to be perfect. No cell signal, no roads, no trace of civilization. Just nature, campfires, and the stars. They piled into an old truck, full of enthusiasm, bringing tents, sleeping bags, and enough food for the weekend. As they drove deeper into the forest, the dirt road narrowed, surrounded by trees that seemed to close in on them. The conversation inside the car faded as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the path. There wasn't a single car or person in sight. They arrived at the campsite, a small clearing surrounded by towering pines and rocks rising on either side. The air was cooler and fresher there, but something about the atmosphere felt different. As they unloaded the car, the silence of the forest settled around them, broken only by the occasional crunch of dry leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. The first night was peaceful. They sat around the fire drinking and laughing. But as the night wore on, the forest around them seemed to come alive with unsettling little sounds. At first it was subtle, the cracking of branches in the distance, a faint whisper of wind through the trees. However, one sound stood out. It was faint but constant, like someone was walking slowly beyond the circle of firelight. "Did you hear that?" asked Rodrigo, his voice low as he looked into the dark forest. "Probably just an animal," Joaquin replied, though there was doubt in his tone. The footsteps sounded light but deliberate, cautiously circling the camp. Ana grabbed her flashlight and pointed it toward the noise, but it only illuminated the stillness of the trees. They didn't see anything, but the feeling that something or someone was lurking didn't go away. Eventually, they dismissed the idea, convincing themselves that it was just their imagination. After all, they were deep in the forest. It was natural for there to be animals. One by one, they retired to their tents as the fire slowly died down to embers. At some point in the night, Rodrigo was awakened by a strange, rhythmic sound. It was a constant noise, like something heavy was hitting the ground repeatedly. His heart started pounding as he tried to figure out the source, but fear kept him frozen in his sleeping bag. He listened for what felt like hours, but eventually exhaustion overtook him. The next morning, what they found deeply unsettled them. Around their tents, someone had placed a series of small rocks in a perfect circle. None of them admitted to doing it, and the disturbing precision of the arrangement made it clear it wasn't an accident. There were no footprints or signs that anyone had passed through during the night. The unease grew among the group, though no one wanted to admit they were scared. They spent the day hiking, trying to shake off the strangeness of the previous night. However, the feeling that something or someone was watching them didn't go away. Every time one of them stopped and looked toward the trees, they thought they saw something moving in the shadows, but whenever they focused their gaze, there was nothing there. Upon returning to camp at dusk, the silence was even more uncomfortable. No one mentioned the rocks, but the tension was palpable. This time they built a bigger fire, hoping the flames would bring them some comfort. As the darkness deepened, the feeling that they weren't alone intensified. The noises began again. Branches snapping and dry leaves rustling, but this time much closer. Joaquin grabbed the flashlight and scanned the perimeter of the camp. For a moment, the light illuminated something. A tall, motionless human figure standing at the edge of the trees. The flashlight flickered, and when they pointed it back, the figure was gone. Panic began to grip the group. They tried to rationalize it, telling themselves it was a trick of the light, or that the darkness was playing tricks on them, but the accumulating terror was undeniable. They huddled closer to the fire, nervously watching the surroundings, every crack and noise making their hearts race. Then, the rhythmic sound from the previous night returned, thump, thump, thump. This time it was closer and louder. The ground seemed to vibrate with each thud. It was no longer an illusion. Something was approaching. Suddenly, the fire went out completely, plunging them into total darkness. There was no moon or stars to light their surroundings, only the suffocating blackness of the night. In the chaos, they tried to find their flashlights, but the batteries inexplicably wouldn't work. The sound grew louder, closer, until it seemed to be right on top of them, then silence. A suffocating, oppressive silence that made it hard to breathe. No one dared to move or speak, fearing whatever was outside. Suddenly, one of them screamed in desperation and ran into the forest. The rest tried to follow, calling out their friend's name in broken voices of terror. But the dense forest swallowed their cries. They ran aimlessly, tripping over branches and roots, blinded by panic. After what felt like hours, they stumbled back to the camp. Somehow the fire had reignited, burning brightly again. However, their friend was gone. His tent was intact, his gear neatly packed as if he had never been there. Terrified and exhausted, they huddled around the fire, desperately waiting for dawn. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. When the first rays of sunlight lit up the forest, they quickly packed up, leaving behind anything non-essential. They never found their friend. Days later, search teams combed the area, but there was no trace of him. They only found the same rocks arranged in circles, like a warning. It was the last weekend of summer, and a group of friends decided to take one last camping trip before the cold set in. They had found a remote spot in a forest near Monterey, miles away from civilization. The camp was surrounded by tall trees swaying in the gentle breeze, and the only sound accompanying them was the occasional crunch of leaves underfoot and the distant call of some wild animal. Everything seemed perfect, isolated, peaceful, and far from the daily grind. As they set up their tents, the sun began to slowly descend, casting long shadows between the trees. By the time they gathered around the campfire, the forest was completely dark, with only the flicker of the flames lighting their faces. They spent hours laughing, joking, and telling stories, without a care beyond keeping the fire going. Everything was going smoothly until Martin, one of the friends, offered to gather more firewood. At first, no one paid much attention to his delay, thinking he was just taking his time. However, when 10 minutes turned into 30, and then an hour, concern began to grow within the group. "We should go look for him," Andrea said, casting a nervous glance at the dark forest. The others nodded, though none of them seemed excited about the idea of venturing into the darkness. They grabbed their flashlights and began walking between the trees, calling out Martin's name. The silence of the forest was unsettling, and the air felt dense, almost heavy. The beams of their flashlights barely cut through the darkness, and the further they went, the more lost the group felt. The trees seemed to repeat themselves, and the paths that once seemed clear now became confusing and labyrinthine. "Martin!" Santiago shouted, but his voice seemed to be swallowed by the thick forest. Just as anxiety began to grip them, Santiago suddenly stopped. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. The group fell silent, listening. From deep within the forest in the distance, they could hear a rhythmic sound. It was a faint knocking, as if someone was repeatedly tapping on wood. "Martin!" Andrea called out again, her voice trembling. There was no answer, just the continuous knocking. Cautiously, the group moved toward the sound, their flashlights nervously sweeping between the trees. The knocking grew louder, more erratic as they approached. Suddenly, Andrea's flashlight illuminated something that made their blood run cold. It was Martin, but something was wrong. He was standing in front of a tree, his face pale and his eyes wide open but vacant. His hand was slowly knocking on the tree trunk with repetitive, forced movements. His knuckles were bruised and bleeding, but he kept knocking. "Martin, what are you doing?" Santiago asked, taking a step toward him. Martin didn't respond. His gaze remained fixed on a distant point, and his hand kept knocking. Knock, knock, knock. Andrea reached out to touch his arm, but as soon as she did, Martin let out a blood-curdling scream and ran into the forest. They chased after him, shouting for him to stop, but Martin seemed to be in a state of panic, running blindly at an inhuman speed. They pursued him until their legs ached and their lungs burned, but eventually they lost sight of him in the dense woods. Disoriented and out of breath, they realized they had no idea where they were. The forest had turned into an oppressive maze of shadows and unseen dangers. "We need to go back," Andrea panted, her voice trembling. "We need to find the camp." But when they turned around, they realized they were completely lost. The forest, which had once seemed familiar, now felt hostile, as if every tree wanted to trap them. Worse still, the knocking sound had returned, this time from all directions surrounding them. Panic overtook them as they stumbled through the trees, desperately trying to find their way back. The knocking grew louder, faster, more chaotic, and with it came a growing sense of terror. Something was following them. Suddenly they heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, crushing the dry leaves beneath them. They were not alone. In the distance, among the trees, they saw figures moving in the shadows. At first they thought it was Martin, but as the figures drew closer, their fear paralyzed them. They were people, but something was wrong. Their movements were clumsy, as if their bodies weren't fully responding. The eyes of those figures glowed faintly in the darkness, reflecting the light of their flashlights. They ran, their hearts pounding, But no matter how hard they tried to escape, the figures kept getting closer and closer. The deafening knocking echoed in their heads, invading every thought. Finally, they reached a clearing, and for a brief moment they thought they were safe. But the figures emerged from the trees surrounding them. They huddled together, back to back, with their flashlights trembling in their hands. Andrea, shaking, whispered, "What do they want?" No one responded. The figures drew closer, the knocking louder in their heads, filling them with a sense of absolute panic. Then suddenly the sound stopped. The figures vanished as if they had never been there. The group stood frozen, too terrified to move or speak. The night dragged on, and the light of dawn finally began to filter through the trees. Somehow they had survived. They stumbled back to camp, disoriented and exhausted, only to find it intact as if nothing had happened. Except for one thing. Martin's tent was gone, as if it had never been there, and they never saw him again. It was supposed to be a peaceful, relaxing weekend in the woods, a break from the stress of everyday life. 4 friends, Daniel, Carmen, Sergio, and Lorena, had been planning this camping trip for months. The allure of a dense, untouched forest, with the promise of starry nights, was enough to even convince Carmen, who was usually reluctant to camp. They arrived at the trailhead late in the afternoon, loaded with gear and food, with a palpable excitement in the air. The sun was already low in the sky as they ventured deeper into the forest, the sound of dry leaves under their boots accompanying them. After several hours of hiking, they finally found the perfect spot, a clearing next to a small lake, surrounded by tall pines that seemed to swallow the last light of the day. By the time they finished setting up camp, the sun had already set, and shadows began to stretch across the lake. Mist slowly rose from the water, covering the area in a cold shroud. They lit a campfire and settled around it, chatting and laughing as the flames crackled softly. Everything seemed perfect, too perfect. As the night wore on, the sounds of the forest became more noticeable. At first they were distant creaks, something they could ignore as animals moving through the bushes. But as the fire began to die down, the sounds became clearer. Branches snapping, leaves crunching, as if something or someone was circling the camp. Sergio, always the bravest, stood up and grabbed a flashlight. "It's probably just a raccoon," he said with a reassuring smile. "I'll scare it off." He ventured into the darkness, shining his flashlight at the nearby trees. The others watched him from the campfire, but the sound seemed to grow closer. "Sergio, come back," Lorena said, her voice tinged with worry. But Sergio didn't respond. He took a few more steps toward the trees, and then silence. The creek stopped abruptly, and the only sound was the soft crackling of the campfire's embers. "Sergio?" Daniel called, standing up, feeling uneasy. There was no response. Sergio's flashlight was no longer visible, and neither was he. Concern began to creep into everyone's minds. "We have to go find him," Carmen said quickly, her breathing growing rapid. Daniel grabbed another flashlight and handed one to Carmen. The two of them ventured into the forest, calling out to Sergio as they walked. The further they moved from the camp, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees seemed to close in around them, and the air was thick with moisture and the sharp smell of decomposing leaves. Suddenly they heard a noise to their left, something low and guttural, as if something was moving among the bushes. Daniel shone his flashlight in that direction but saw nothing. They kept moving, their voices growing shakier as they called out to their friend. Finally they found him. He was on the ground, his flashlight pointing toward a nearby tree. There were no signs of a struggle, but something wasn't right. Deeply carved into the tree's bark was a strange symbol, roughly drawn. It seemed deliberate, made by human hands, but with a clear, sinister intent. "What the hell is this?" Carmen whispered, stepping back, terrified. Daniel didn't answer. His heart raced as he scanned the area with his flashlight, feeling like something horrible was surrounding them. They decided to head back to camp, but soon realized they were lost. The trees looked identical, and the path they had taken seemed to have vanished. The mist had thickened, enveloping them in a shroud of uncertainty. The forest seemed watchful, as if it knew they were there. "Daniel, where are we?" Carmen asked, her voice on the verge of panic. "I don't know," Daniel replied, his voice trembling, "but we have to keep moving." They pushed through the bushes, stumbling over roots and rocks. Every shifting shadow sent shivers down their spines, and every sound made their hearts race. They spent what felt like hours, or maybe minutes in that darkness, with no sense of time. Finally, when they were about to give up, they spotted the faint glow of the campfire, now almost extinguished. They ran toward the clearing, gasping for breath from the effort and accumulated fear. But their relief was short-lived. Lorena was standing by the fire, her back to them. Her posture was strange, her head tilted at an unnatural angle and her arms hung limply at her sides. "Lorena?" Daniel called, disbelief in his voice. She didn't respond. "Is she okay?" Carmen asked, horrified. They approached her slowly, each step filled with doubt and fear. When Lorena turned around, what they saw froze their blood. Her eyes were open, empty, and her skin was pale and colorless. But what terrified them the most was the blood. Thick streams of dark blood ran down her face, dripping from her mouth and hands. "Lorena!" Carmen screamed, rushing toward her, but Daniel stopped her. "There's something wrong with her," Daniel whispered, pulling Carmen away. Lorena gave a grotesque smile, one that stretched unnaturally across her face. She took a step toward them, then another. Her movement spasmodic, as if she had no control over her own body. Behind her, more figures began to emerge from the trees. They were men, their faces dark and expressionless, their eyes empty, and they moved in silence. "We have to leave," Daniel said, barely able to contain his panic. But it was too late. The figures were advancing slowly, surrounding them, their gazes fixed, full of unknown intentions. Lorena let out a chilling, guttural laugh that echoed among the trees. And suddenly the fire went out, plunging them into total darkness. Fear had completely consumed them. The group of friends, Sebastian, Laura, Mariana, and Carlos, had embarked on a weekend camping trip deep in the forest, far from any marked trail. They were experienced campers, having done this many times before, but this time something felt different. The air seemed heavier, and the thick canopy of trees above muffled the daylight, casting long shadows even in the middle of the afternoon. By the time they reached the spot they had chosen, twilight was settling in, and the silence of the forest was oppressive. Sebastian, the most adventurous of the group, shrugged, insisting it was just nerves from being so far away from everything. "We're in the middle of nowhere. It's perfect," he said, trying to calm their nerves. Carlos and Mariana nodded, though Laura couldn't shake the growing sense of unease building in her chest. When night fell, they lit a fire and sat around it. The flickering flames cast unsettling shadows on their faces as they started to tell stories and laugh about old memories. However, every now and then, Laura would glance into the darkness surrounding them, feeling as though something was watching. She didn't want to mention it, not wanting to seem paranoid. The first night passed without major events, though Laura barely slept. She was disturbed by the strange sounds that echoed through the forest, low creaks, distant footsteps, as if someone or something was walking around the camp. Every time she opened her eyes, she saw only the stillness of the forest and the dark silhouettes of trees swaying in the wind. The next morning, Laura finally spoke up. "Did anyone else hear strange noises last night?" she asked as they gathered around the fire. Mariana shrugged. "It's just the forest, probably animals." But Sebastian and Carlos exchanged uncomfortable glances. Sebastian was the first to admit it. "I heard something too, like someone was walking nearby, but there's no one out here." His attempt to rationalize the situation didn't do much to calm the growing tension in the group. They spent the day hiking, trying to shake off the ominous feeling from the previous night. But the deeper they ventured into the forest, the more disconcerting everything became. Carlos noticed some strange markings on the trees, crude symbols carved into the bark, some fresh, others old and worn. "Who the hell did this?" he murmured, feeling a chill run down his spine. "Probably just kids messing around," Sebastian replied, though his voice also betrayed uncertainty. As the sun began to set, they returned to camp, but something was wrong. The firewood they had gathered earlier was scattered, the tents partially collapsed, and their belongings were strewn all over the campsite. "This wasn't done by an animal," Mariana whispered, her voice trembling. Sebastian checked the surroundings, but there was no sign of anyone. The trees stood still, casting long shadows in the fading light. "We should leave," Laura said urgently. "Something's not right here." But Sebastian, stubborn and refusing to be intimidated, insisted on staying. "We've come too far to turn back now. It's probably just a prank, other campers trying to scare us." Reluctantly, they decided to stay, But the atmosphere had changed. As night enveloped the forest once again, the group gathered around the fire, all of them with their eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the firelight. The sound started again, faint at first, a crack, the distant snap of a broken branch. But then they grew louder, closer, as if something or someone was moving just at the edge of the fire's glow. Carlos stood up, holding a flashlight, and pointed it toward the trees. "Who's there?" he called out firmly, but the only answer was the wind whispering through the leaves. Suddenly the fire flickered, as if someone had passed by. At that moment they all saw it, a figure, someone dressed in dark clothing just beyond the trees, watching them. Sebastian jumped to his feet. "Did you see that?" he asked, his heart racing. But before anyone could respond, the figure was gone, swallowed by the darkness. Panic gripped the group. They hurriedly grabbed their things, determined to leave immediately. But as they prepared to go, the noises intensified. The footsteps, now unmistakable, came from all directions. Laura let out a scream when something invisible brushed against her in the darkness. Their flashlights flickered wildly as they tried to illuminate whatever was stalking them. Suddenly, Sebastian was yanked backward, disappearing into the forest with a guttural scream. The others stood frozen in terror. Carlos, who was closest to him, ran toward the sound, shouting his name, but it was in vain. Sebastian was already gone. The three remaining friends ran without looking back, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for the path. Their breaths were ragged, their hearts pounding in their ears. Behind them, they clearly heard the sound of someone chasing them. Branches snapping and hurried footsteps through the trees. They didn't stop until they reached a small clearing. Gasping for air, Mariana looked back, her eyes wide with panic. "Where's Carlos?" she asked, her voice filled with fear. Laura turned around and realized he was no longer with them. The forest was silent again in an unnatural way, as if it were holding its breath. "We have to keep moving," Laura whispered, grabbing Mariana's hand. They moved on, desperate to find the trail, to escape whatever was stalking them. But the further they went, the more the forest seemed to close in around them. The trees grew denser, and the air grew heavier. Hours passed, or maybe only minutes, it was impossible to tell. Mariana tripped, her foot caught on something. Laura helped her up, but when they looked down, they both froze. Lying on the ground was a torn piece of Sebastian's jacket, covered in dark stains of dirt. A soft crack echoed through the trees again, this time closer than before. Laura held her breath as she looked around, her eyes wide with terror. "We have to go," she whispered, pulling Mariana forward. But as they moved, the sound followed them, the crunch of leaves and the snap of branches right behind them. When they finally reached the edge of the forest, the first rays of sunlight were beginning to peek over the horizon. Mariana screamed. A man, dirty and disheveled, lunged at her, grabbing her ankle with a tight grip. Laura reacted quickly, hitting the man with a rock, allowing them to escape and run toward the dawn. When Laura finally found a dirt road, she collapsed to the ground, exhausted. Hours later, a hiker found her crying and unable to give a coherent explanation of what had happened. The search parties found nothing. There was no sign of Sebastian, Mariana, or Carlos. The camp was intact, but there was no trace of the friends. The forest had consumed them, leaving only the unsettling memory of the dangers that lurk deep within nature. Alvaro and Elisa had always loved the outdoors, so when their friend Ernesto suggested a weekend camping trip deep in the forest, they didn't hesitate to accept the proposal. The three of them drove for hours, leaving the city behind and heading into a remote area, far from any trace of civilization. The forest grew denser, the paths narrower, and the feeling of isolation intensified as they advanced. Finally, they found the perfect spot, a clearing surrounded by towering trees, with a lake of crystal-clear water just a few meters away. The tranquility of the environment promised a weekend of absolute relaxation. As they set up camp, Ernesto mentioned something curious about the area. "This place has a weird history," he said. "A few years ago they found some abandoned camps here. No one knows what happened to the people who were in them." Alvaro and Elisa laughed, dismissing the stories as mere rumors. Ernesto, however, smiled, clearly pleased to have sown a bit of unease in them. They spent the afternoon exploring the surroundings, walking through the forest and fishing in the lake. The sun began to set, painting the sky a fiery orange as they returned to camp. They gathered around the fire, sharing beers and telling stories as night fell completely. But as the darkness settled in, the atmosphere changed. The same woods that had once seemed welcoming now felt strange and threatening, with the crunch of leaves and distant calls of nocturnal animals. The trio tried to ignore the feeling and continued joking, trying to move away from Ernesto's stories. Finally, they decided to retreat to their tents, leaving the fire still softly crackling, the only source of light cutting through the growing darkness. Alvaro lay in his sleeping bag, listening to the sounds outside. The wind whistled through the trees, and from time to time he heard the snap of a twig. He attributed it to the local wildlife, but then he heard something different. Footsteps, clear and slow. He sat up abruptly, his heart racing, trying to listen again. The footsteps stopped. He stepped out into the cool night air and scanned the surroundings. The forest seemed quieter than usual, and the fire was nearly out. Seeing nothing unusual, he returned to his tent, but sleep didn't come easily. Throughout the night, he kept hearing those faint noises, as if someone was prowling around the camp. But each time he got up, he found only the dark calm of the forest. The next morning, Elisa woke him with a soft touch. Her face was pale, and she looked visibly shaken. "Alvaro, where's Ernesto?" she asked, her voice trembling. Alvaro quickly got up and looked around. Ernesto's tent was completely open, but there was no sign of him. They started calling his name, searching the camp for any clues, but found nothing. His phone, his gear, everything was still there, as if he had simply vanished. As the hours passed, panic began to set in. Elisa wanted to leave immediately to get help, but Alvaro was hesitant. What if Ernesto comes back? He reasoned. They decided to wait a few more hours, but by midday, with no sign of Ernesto, Alvaro noticed something strange. Footprints. Clearly, they were Ernesto's boot prints leading deeper into the forest. However, they stopped abruptly, as if he had been lifted off the ground. There were no signs of a struggle or drag marks. They quickly packed what little they could carry, fear replacing any sense of adventure. Elisa kept glancing over her shoulder, uneasy. As they walked, Alvaro saw something that chilled him to the bone. A word carved into the bark of a tree. "Alvaro." "What is this?" Elisa whispered, her voice filled with terror. They quickened their pace, running down the trail without stopping to rest. When they finally reached the car, their panic grew even more. The tires had been slashed. They were trapped. Alvaro tried using his phone, but there was no signal. Elisa collapsed to the ground sobbing. As he tried to comfort her, a noise caught his attention, slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the forest. He turned but saw nothing. The footsteps grew louder, as if someone was stalking them, always just out of sight. Without saying another word, they grabbed what little they could carry and began running down the dirt road, hoping to find help. The footsteps continued behind them, but every time they looked back, there was nothing. The sun began to set again, and the shadows grew longer. Just when they thought they couldn't run any further, Elisa stopped abruptly, her face frozen in absolute terror. "Alvaro," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Look." In front of them, blocking the path, was Ernesto. His face was expressionless, and his eyes were blank. It seemed like something had happened to him, but he was completely still. Alvaro tried speaking to him, but Ernesto didn't respond, didn't even react. "We have to keep going," Alvaro whispered, grabbing Elisa's hand. Terror drove them to run once more, leaving their friend behind, lost or deranged, not knowing what had happened to him. However, the footsteps never stopped, following them closely as darkness completely enveloped the forest. It was supposed to be a peaceful and relaxing weekend in the woods, a getaway from the stress of daily life. 4 friends, Martín, Sarah, Juan, and Lorena, had been planning this camping trip for months. The idea of being in a dense forest with no marked trails and under a star-filled sky was enough to even convince Sarah, who normally resisted the idea of sleeping outdoors. They arrived at the trailhead in the afternoon, loaded with gear, food, and palpable excitement. The sun hung low in the sky as they ventured into the forest, the sound of crunching leaves under their boots accompanying their walk. After hours of hiking, they finally found the perfect spot, a clearing by a small lake, surrounded by pines that seemed to swallow the last light of the day. By the time they set up camp, the sun had already disappeared behind the horizon, casting long shadows over the lake. The air grew colder, and a fine mist began to rise from the water. They lit a campfire and settled in for the night, chatting and laughing as the flames danced and crackled. Everything seemed perfect, almost too perfect. As the night wore on, strange noises began to echo from the surrounding forest. At first, it was just the sound of branches snapping, something they assumed was normal in nature. But as the fire burned down, the sounds became clearer, the snap of twigs and leaves, as if someone was walking around their camp. Juan, always the most fearless, stood up and grabbed a flashlight. "It's probably just an animal," he said with a reassuring smile to calm the others. "I'll scare it off." He walked toward the edge of the forest, shining the flashlight around. The others watched him as the beam flickered between the trees, but the noises seemed to get closer. "Juan, come back," Lorena called, worry in her voice. Juan didn't respond. He took a few more steps toward the trees, and then everything went silent. The noises stopped completely, and the flashlight's beam disappeared into the shadows of the forest. Martín stood up, alarmed. "Juan!" he shouted, but there was no response. Panic began to rise among them. Sarah stood up too, her breathing quickened. "We have to go find him," Martín said, grabbing another flashlight and handing one to Sarah. Together they began to venture into the forest, calling Juan's name. The further they moved from camp, the darker and more oppressive the environment became. The trees seemed to close in around them, the air thick with humidity. Suddenly they heard a noise to their left, a low sound like something moving through the underbrush. Martín pointed the flashlight in that direction, but saw nothing. They kept walking, their voices shaky as they called Juan's name, and then they found it. Juan's flashlight lay on the ground, its light pointing toward a nearby tree. There was no sign of Juan, but something else. Disordered footprints and signs that someone had struggled near the spot. "What is this?" Sarah whispered, taking a step back. Martín didn't respond. His heart raced as he scanned the area with the flashlight. Something was wrong. They decided to return to camp, but soon realized they were lost. The trees all looked the same, and the trail they had come from seemed to have disappeared. The mist had thickened, swirling around them as if the forest itself were trying to confuse them. "Martin, where are we?" Sarah asked, her voice full of panic. "I don't know," Martín admitted, his voice trembling, "but we have to keep moving." They pushed through the underbrush, stumbling over roots and rocks. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound was a potential threat. They wandered for hours, or maybe just minutes. Time had lost all meaning in the darkness. Just when they thought they'd never escape, they saw the faint glow of the dying fire at their camp. Relief washed over them as they stumbled toward the clearing, gasping from the effort. But their relief was short-lived. Lorena was standing by the fire, her back to them. Her posture seemed rigid, her head bowed. "Lorena?" Martín called softly. She didn't respond. "Is she okay?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. They moved closer, their steps slow and hesitant, and then Lorena turned around. Her expression was pure terror, her eyes wide open and filled with fear. Bloodstains covered her hands and her breathing was erratic. "Lorena!" Sarah screamed, running toward her, but Martín stopped her. "Don't go near her," Martín whispered, pulling Sarah back. Lorena tried to say something, but she was in shock. Behind her, figures began to emerge from the trees. People with torn, dirty clothes, their eyes fixed on them like predators stalking prey. The figures moved slowly, surrounding them. "We have to leave," Martín whispered, barely audible. But it was already too late. The figures kept coming closer, step by step. Lorena began to sob, unable to speak, as the figures fully encircled them. The group of 4 friends, Martín, Carla, Sarah, and Luis, embarked on their weekend getaway to a remote forest, far from any marked trail. They were experienced campers, having done this type of trip many times before. However, this time something felt different. The air seemed heavier, and the thick canopy of trees barely let daylight through, casting long shadows even in the afternoon. By the time they reached the spot they had chosen to camp, dusk was already setting in, and the silence of the forest felt oppressive. Martín, the most adventurous of the group, dismissed the uneasy feeling that seemed to grip everyone. "We're in the middle of nowhere, it's perfect," he said, trying to lighten the mood. Luis and Sarah nodded, though Carla couldn't shake the unsettling feeling growing in her chest. When night fell, they lit a campfire and sat around it. The flames cast eerie shadows over their faces. They began telling stories, laughing about old memories. But Carla kept glancing into the dark surroundings, feeling as though something was watching them. She wanted to mention it, but didn't want to seem paranoid. The first night passed without incident, though Carla barely slept, disturbed by the strange noises that echoed through the forest. Creaks, soft sounds of footsteps, as if someone was prowling around the camp. Each time she opened her eyes, all she saw was the stillness of the forest and the dark silhouettes of trees swaying with the wind. The next morning, Carla decided to speak up. "Did anyone else hear weird noises last night?" she asked as everyone gathered around the fire. Sarah shrugged. "It's just the forest, probably animals," she replied, trying to downplay it. But Martine and Luis exchanged uncomfortable looks. Martine was the first to admit it. "I heard something too, like someone was walking around, but there's no one out here," he said, though he tried to sound rational. They spent the day hiking, trying to shake off the ominous feeling from the night before. But the deeper they ventured into the forest, the more unsettling things became. Luis noticed strange markings on the trees, crude symbols carved into the bark, some fresh, others old and worn. "Who the hell did this?" he murmured, feeling a chill run down his spine. "Probably just kids messing around," Martine said, though there was clear uncertainty in his voice. As the sun began to set, they returned to camp, but something was wrong. The firewood they had collected earlier was scattered, the tents partially collapsed, and their belongings were strewn all over the place. "This wasn't an animal," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "Who did this?" Martine scanned the area, but there were no signs of anyone. The trees stood tall and silent, casting long shadows in the fading light. "We should leave," Carla said, her voice full of urgency. "Something's not right here." But Martine, stubborn as always, insisted on staying. "We've come too far to turn back now," he said. "This is just a prank, probably some other campers trying to scare us." Reluctantly, the others agreed to stay, but the atmosphere had changed drastically. When darkness enveloped the forest again, the group huddled around the fire, all eyes fixed on the shadows beyond the firelight. The noises started again, faint at first. A creak here, a snap of branches there. But gradually they became more intense, as if someone or something was approaching, moving just beyond the reach of the light. Luis jumped to his feet, grabbing a flashlight, and pointed it toward the trees. "Who's there?" he shouted, but the only response was the wind whispering through the leaves. Suddenly the fire flickered as if something had passed close by, momentarily blocking the light. And in that brief instant they all saw it. An indistinct figure just beyond the trees, watching them. Martine jumped up. "Did you see that?" he asked, his heart racing. But before anyone could respond, the figure disappeared, swallowed by the darkness. Panic set in. They hurriedly gathered their belongings, determined to leave, but as they prepared to go, the noises grew louder, closer. The footsteps were unmistakable now, echoing from all directions. Carla screamed as something invisible brushed against her in the darkness. Everyone shook their flashlights frantically, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was stalking them. Without warning, Martine was yanked backward, disappearing into the thick forest with a gut-wrenching scream. The others stood frozen in terror. Luis, who was closest to Martine, ran toward the sound, shouting his name, but it was in vain. Martine was already gone. The three remaining friends ran, crashing through the underbrush without regard for direction. They didn't care about the path, they just wanted to escape. Their breaths came in ragged gasps, and the sound of snapping branches behind them confirmed that someone was chasing them. They ran until they reached a small clearing, gasping for air. Sarah looked around, her eyes wide with panic. "Where's Luis?" she asked, fear in her voice. Carla quickly turned, realizing Luis was no longer with them. The forest had fallen back into an eerie silence, as if everything had paused, waiting. There was no sign of Luis or Martine, only darkness and the tangled shadows among the trees. "We have to keep moving," Carla whispered, pulling Sarah to continue. With fear in their hearts, the two pressed on, trying to find the trail or any sign of a way out. But the further they went, the more the forest seemed to close in on them, the trees twisting under the pale moonlight. They wandered for hours, or maybe just minutes. It was impossible to tell. Time had lost all meaning in that place. Sarah stumbled, her foot caught on something on the ground. Carla helped her up, but when they looked down, both froze in horror. There, on the ground, lay a torn piece of Martine's jacket covered in dark stains. A soft crack echoed through the trees again, this time closer than before. Carla held her breath, looking around with wide, terrified eyes. "We have to go," she whispered, pulling Sarah forward. The sound of leaves and branches breaking under someone's weight followed them. Finally, when they broke through the edge of the forest, the first light of dawn was beginning to peek over the horizon. Sarah screamed in horror when something cold grabbed her, pulling her back into the forest. Carla turned, but it was too late. Sarah's scream was quickly swallowed by the silence of the forest. Carla ran, now completely alone, her heart racing and her eyes filled with tears. She stumbled onto a dirt road and, exhausted, collapsed to the ground. Hours later, she was found babbling incoherently about her friend's disappearance. Search teams found no trace of Martine, Luis, or Sarah. The camp remained intact, but the forest had swallowed them, leaving behind only uncertainty and fear. Martine and Carla had always enjoyed the outdoors, so when their friend Esteban suggested a camping trip to a remote forest, they eagerly accepted the idea. The trio drove for hours, leaving the city behind and venturing into an area far from any town or civilization. The forest grew denser, the paths narrower, and the sense of isolation deeper. Finally, they found the ideal spot, a secluded clearing surrounded by tall trees, with a crystal-clear lake nearby. As they set up camp, Esteban mentioned that the area had a strange reputation. Years ago, several hikers had disappeared without a trace. "Really?" Carla asked with an incredulous smile. "Is this one of those stories to scare tourists?" Martine and Carla laughed, dismissing the story as a simple legend. Esteban smiled, clearly enjoying the attention he had generated. They spent the afternoon exploring the forest and fishing in the lake. As night fell, the sun sank below the horizon, casting an orange glow over the trees. They gathered around the campfire, sharing beers and telling stories. But as darkness enveloped the camp, the atmosphere began to feel different. What had once seemed like a welcoming forest now felt unsettling, with distant sounds and the whisper of leaves. Finally, they decided to retire to their tents. Martine remained awake, staring at the ceiling of his tent and listening to the sounds outside. He heard the wind among the trees and occasionally the snap of a branch. He tried to calm himself, thinking it was just wildlife, but then he heard something different, a faint noise like footsteps. Martine sat up, his heart racing, and listened closely. There it was again, a soft sound that seemed to come from the forest. He stepped out into the cold night air. The fire was nearly out and the forest was silent. He scanned the area with his eyes, but everything seemed in order. Just as he was about to return to his tent, the sound came again. This time, clearer footsteps, as if someone was walking among the trees. Martine took a few steps toward the edge of the clearing, trying to find an explanation. He looked over at Carla and Esteban's tents, but there was no movement. Both were sound asleep. A growing sense of unease crept over him, but he decided it was just his imagination due to exhaustion. He returned to his tent, though sleep didn't come easily. The noises outside kept him on edge for hours. The next morning, Carla woke him. "Martine, where's Esteban?" she asked, her voice trembling. Martine quickly sat up, looking around. Esteban's tent was open, but there was no sign of him. They called his name, but there was no response. His hiking boots were gone, but the rest of his gear was still there. As the hours passed, their concern grew. Carla insisted they head back to find help, but Martine was reluctant, worried that Esteban would return at any moment. They decided to wait a few more hours. By midday, there was still no sign of him. That's when Martine noticed something strange. Boot prints, clearly Esteban's, leading into the forest. They followed the trail, but it abruptly stopped, leaving no trace. There were no signs of a struggle or drag marks, just the emptiness where the footprints ended. With fear mounting, they packed quickly, the sense of adventure now replaced by palpable fear. As they gathered their things, Carla confessed something she had been keeping to herself. "I heard footsteps last night too, but I didn't want to scare you," she said, her eyes filled with terror. As they began the long hike back to the car, the forest seemed to change around them. The trails that had once seemed familiar now appeared foreign and dangerous. Every shadow between the trees seemed to move, stalking them. A few kilometers later, Martine saw something that left him frozen. Carved into the bark of a tree was the word Martine. Fear immediately gripped him. Who could have done this? Carla asked, pale. They quickened their pace, desperate to escape the forest. When they finally reached the trailhead, their car was still there. but the tires had been slashed. A wave of panic washed over them. They were trapped. Martin tried using his phone, but there was no signal. Carla, overwhelmed with fear, collapsed to the ground. Just then, a sound caught Martin's attention. Slow, heavy footsteps, approaching from the forest. Martin quickly turned, but saw nothing. The footsteps grew closer. Without saying a word, they grabbed what little they could carry and ran down the dirt road, hoping to find help. The footsteps followed, always just behind them, but they could never see who or what was stalking them. The sun began to set again, and the shadows grew longer and longer. Finally, they heard a car in the distance. They ran toward the sound, and when they reached the main road, they saw a vehicle stopped. The driver, a middle-aged man, looked at them curiously as they climbed desperately into the car. "What happened to you?" the man asked. But Martin and Carla had no words to explain what they had experienced. They just wanted to get far away from the forest, from the footprints that stopped without reason, and from the strange figures they could never see, but always felt behind them. The idea of a weekend in the woods had come up as the perfect escape. Martin, Laura, Matteo, and Julia had planned it for months, longing to get away from the hustle and bustle of the city, reconnect with nature, and enjoy the tranquility that only a distant forest could offer. For Laura, always skeptical about sleeping outdoors, it was hard to convince her, but the promise of spending time with her friends and seeing a starry sky was enough to make her agree. The afternoon they arrived was bathed in golden sunlight, and although clouds were beginning to gather on the horizon, the air still smelled of fresh earth and tall trees that seemed to touch the sky. They walked along the trail with energy, carrying backpacks full of gear and provisions. Jokes and laughter filled the air as they ventured further and further into the heart of the forest, where civilization already seemed like a distant memory. Upon finding a clearing by a lake, they decided it would be the ideal place to set up camp. The pines, tall and serene, surrounded the small lagoon, and their reflections danced on the still water. Everything was perfect, perhaps too perfect. As the sun disappeared behind the mountains and darkness enveloped the landscape, they lit a campfire. The flames cast flickering shadows on the trees, and the crackling of the fire filled the silence of the night. Between jokes and memories, the group felt invincible, as if the outside world couldn't touch them in that corner of nature. But, as with every story that begins with the promise of calm, the first signs that something was wrong didn't take long to appear. The crunching started sporadically, as if a small animal was moving through the bushes. But as the night wore on, the sounds became more persistent, closer. The wind blew, but there was something unsettling about how the branches snapped in the distance, as if something heavier than a raccoon was lurking in the darkness. "It's probably just an animal," Matteo said, always brave, grabbing a flashlight and venturing to the edge of the forest. The others watched him, trusting his carefree attitude, but soon the laughter died out. The crunching intensified just as Matteo disappeared among the trees. The beam of his flashlight flickered in the distance, but his normally firm footsteps faded. Suddenly, the forest fell silent, an eerie silence. "Matteo, come back," Julia said, her voice filled with worry. There was no response. Martin and Laura exchanged looks, knowing something wasn't right. Without thinking twice, Martin grabbed another flashlight and ventured into the forest with Laura close behind. As they walked, the air grew heavier, and the ground seemed to give way beneath their feet, as if the forest itself was trying to swallow them. They called out to Matteo repeatedly, but all they found was his flashlight, lying on the ground, its light still on, pointing toward a nearby tree. A deep, guttural crunch echoed to their left, a noise so low and unnatural that it didn't seem right. Martin swung the flashlight in that direction but saw nothing. Laura was breathing rapidly, trying not to succumb to panic. "What was that?" she asked in a barely audible whisper. "I don't know," Martin replied, his heart pounding. They hurried back to camp, only to discover a scene that froze their souls. Julia was standing by the nearly extinguished fire, her back to them. Something wasn't right. Her posture was unnatural, her head tilted at a strange angle, and her arms hung limply. "Julia, are you okay?" Martin asked, his voice weak. When she turned around, horror gripped them. Julia's eyes were wide open, but her gaze was empty. Her skin had a grayish tone, and thick lines of blood ran from her mouth to her hands. The night silence was deafening, and Laura's heart raced. "Julia!" Laura screamed, taking a step toward her. But Martin stopped her, sensing that something much darker was happening. The Julia they knew was no longer there. Something had found her in her most vulnerable state. Something or someone had attacked her while they were in the forest. The blood on her body was a testament to the brutality of the attack, and the shock she was in had left her completely disconnected from reality. The danger wasn't over. As Martin and Laura backed away from Julia, they noticed the shadows among the trees beginning to move. They weren't supernatural creatures. They were the calculated movements of the man who had been stalking them since they arrived. This faceless individual, with clearly violent intentions, had patiently waited for the perfect moment to strike. Now, with his palpable presence, he was ready to trap them in his deadly snare. "We have to go," Martin whispered, pulling Laura toward the car. But it was already too late. The man had surrounded the camp, trapping them in the darkness of the forest. The fire went out, and at that moment they knew that Matteo wasn't coming back and that Julia would never be the same. They were at the mercy of a predator, and escape seemed impossible. With the certainty that the terror was just beginning, Martin and Laura knew they wouldn't come out of that nightmare in the woods unscathed.